really difficult to change. But sometimes there's like super easy, super quick things we can do that changes behavior effectively. So, a little bit about me. Some of you have already heard this spiel, so I'm going to share a kind of embarrassing story about myself. So I really love learning. It's fun for me. I find it so interesting. I crave it. One time I was in my office. I thought the building was empty, and I read this research article, and it just blew my mind. And so I shouted out, "I love learning!" Little did I know, I was not alone in the building. So now people tease me and they'll shout that at me randomly because I love learning. So I just really do get excited about learning because I feel like we're in so many situations where we're just desperately trying to help people, and we don't always have the answers. We don't always know how, and so the more we learn, the more we can help, and so the more people that can heal. So I am passionate about learning. I got my master's in counseling. I got my other master's in behavior analysis. Then I got my doctorate in behavior analysis as well. So I think I'm done with school. My family doesn't really believe that I am. We'll see. But yeah, so I have a private practice where I do mental health counseling, but then I also work full-time for an autism company where we do ABA therapy, and I'm the training director there. Excuse me. And then I'm also an adjunct professor at Pepperdine University. So I like to do a variety of things. So, quick poll. Where do you guys struggle with problem behaviors the most? Like if you were to say, oh my gosh, this is where I see it the most, this is what I want a solution for, what is that? What do you guys think?
Classroom.
In the classroom? What about the classroom is a struggle?
Sometimes it's overstimulated.
Yeah. Okay. What other problem behaviors are you guys seeing that you're like, oh, I would love to just easily solve this?
Oh, the issue with high school kids not completing their work.
Okay, yeah, not finishing.
Organization skills.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. That's such an important skill. Motivation, time management, those executive functioning skills a lot of our students struggle with. So yeah, that's a really great example.
Cursing.
Sure.
From young age too.
Sure. What normally brings it out when you see it? What are like the triggers for it?
I don't think that there's really any, like, you just
They're just randomly. Do you think the peers think it's cool?
I don't really think so. I don't think they really, not a lot of them notice,
Okay.
but I mean, I think that like it's just random.
Okay. All right. I think I saw a hand up over here.
Self-harm.
Self-harm, yeah, that is a big one. If we could solve that for everyone everywhere, that would be amazing. What else? Any other behaviors? Oh, what was that?
Transitions.
Oh, yes, that is such a struggle for so many students.
Center time.
What was that?
Center time.
Oh, center time. Attending and focusing, participating through that. Yeah, absolutely. So there are so many situations that we're in, whether it be with our students, our spouses, our kids, us, where there's problem behavior that can be managed if we implement a few strategies. So today we're going to brainstorm about that. Hopefully we'll have some ideas that you guys feel like you can walk away with and use. Just kind of working through what can we do to get people to do what we want them to do. So, first thing is antecedent strategies. So when we're thinking about antecedent strategies, we're thinking about what can we do before the behavior happens. So a lot of times antecedent strategies are super, super helpful, but it can be a problem if your student is dependent on them. So I do have mixed feelings about using antecedent strategies. If your student needs antecedent strategies, all the time, then they're going to be dependent on them and they're going to be limited by them. So if it's possible to fade out those supports so they don't need them for the rest of their life, that's ideal, because we want all of our students to be able to function successfully in every environment they're in without needing those additional supports. But if we're looking at antecedent strategies as a way that we can support them, we can get them to be successful, and then we can kind of build up to that independence, then absolutely. So the first one is warnings. So if I tell my kid, turn off your video games right now, unexpectedly you don't get any warning, that's pretty disappointing. And like, think about if you're in the middle of a conversation, you're done now. Like that kind of stinks, right? So a simple warning is a really easy way to prevent problem behaviors. So 5-minute warning, 10-minute warning, simple things like that can make a really big difference. Setting expectations. This one, a lot of times we think we are more clear than we really are. So in previous presentations today, I talked about how a lot of times we only give expectations verbally, and this can be a problem for a lot of our students. So what can happen is some of our students struggle to process things just from listening. They struggle with the distractions and everything going on in the environment. So they miss the expectations. Or maybe the expectations are implied. Maybe they're never talked about. So like in this room, for example, everybody is being super polite, quiet. Never once did I start the presentation with, here's the list of rules for how to behave in here. You guys just automatically knew how to behave in this room. Some of our students are missing those cues. They're not picking up on the environment and reading, hey, this is expected behavior here. So if we spell that out, sometimes in the form of a social story, we can say, hey, you're going to Mrs. Shoebox room. And so in Mrs. Shoebox room, here are the expectations. This is expected behavior. This is unexpected behavior. And just giving those examples of not only what to do, but what not to do. This is really going to help set them up for success. And then we're not assuming that they just understand what all the expectations are. So the next one is role playing. So I really like role playing because a lot of times we can have conversations with people and they engage and they seem like they really understand, but when it comes time for application, it's not as clear. So if you role play with someone, real life situations, and if you role play expectations, you can have that confidence that they know what's happening. And what's cool about that from a brain perspective, every time we engage in something, it creates neural pathways in our brain. And so even if it's pretend, even if it's practicing, we're creating those neural pathways that make it easier for us to engage in it the second time, the third time, the fourth time. So when you have a behavior that you do all the time, it feels kind of automatic. It feels like you can do it without thinking. That's because the neural pathways in your brain are like a super highway, super wide, easy to go down. You want to try and do something new, you want to create a new habit. It's like you got a machete and you're going through the jungle. And so your brain is just like, oh, I haven't made that path yet. It's like, this is hard. You know, so it's challenging. But the more you do it, the wider the path gets and the easier it gets. And so you have enough of a pathway then that it becomes automatic. So role playing can help create that path. So when real life happens, they already have that started, so it's not as big of a struggle. Next is visuals. So there are so many ways you can use visuals. We have students who have laminated visuals in their showers. We have morning routines. We have the day's schedule. Somebody mentioned in here that transitions are a schedule. Having a visual schedule so they know what to expect for their whole day has helped a lot of students transition through. Sometimes just knowing what's coming next, knowing what to expect, that can really, really help reduce anxiety and avoidant behavior. Sometimes that can backfire on you though. If the child really, really doesn't like what comes next and they know what comes next, you might see some escape behavior. So that can, go both ways. But what are some other ways you guys use visuals in your classroom? Can you guys share any examples?
We have a visual calendar every day with times on it, and I have it with the digital times, and I have a digital clock right above it, so they can see the picture and the time to what's coming next.
That's awesome, that's perfect. What are some other visuals that you guys have seen in classrooms?
If you want this, then we need to do this, or these are your choices.
Absolutely, first then boards or choice boards, I love it. Anything else?
Anchor charts, communication.
Did you say anger?
Anchor charts.
Oh,
Like
okay.
strategic concept using illustrations, using visuals.
Awesome.
We have a child who his schedule is printed on a manila folder, and as he finishes each day, he covers it. So it's like it follows his day, but it's at his desk, and so after math is over so he kind of sees how much he has left of his day, because that's kind of an issue with him. So it's covered, it's done, it's out of the way, because the whole schedule's a lot.
I love it. That's really cool. I don't know if everyone heard that. She has her schedule for her student throughout the day, and as he completes it, it gets covered up, so it's even more of a visual. Like, you did this, out of sight, out of mind. So that's awesome. So the last one is modifying the environment. So we can modify the environment in a lot of different ways. So if you were at my previous presentations today, one of the major ways we want to modify the environment is setting it up so good behaviors get reinforced and the behaviors that we don't want to see are ineffective. So a small way to do that is put a student who struggles with two students who are really strong in that area. If you simply put them next to each other, the social reinforcement that happens from those two students can help that other student kind of catch up. And so that's especially effective when we're talking about problem behavior. If it's not cool to talk out of class, if it's not cool to cuss or to get up out of your seat, if the two peers next to you are like, dude, what are you doing? Then that's not as reinforcing for them. Versus if they're next to students who are like, hee 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 hee, that was so funny, you did that, good job. That's very reinforcing. So if you can set up your classroom so that they aren't reinforced for their problem behavior by their peers, it's gonna really help you. Another example of how you can modify the environment, is that coming?
I don't know what's going on with my.
Oh, I thought it was coming from my computer. So another way you can modify the environment is changing around where things are placed. So if we have a student who elopes, where would you guys place them in this classroom? Well, away from the door.
As many obstacles in the place of kids.
Yes, exactly. She said furthest from the door with as many obstacles as possible in between him and the door, right? So back there by the door is about the worst place you can put them. So if we know our students' patterns, we can kind of set things up. So maybe I'm gonna work in the corner up here with that student so that they're kind of away from distractions and they're pretty far away from the door, so I'm not as worried about them getting a quick and easy escape. What are some other examples you guys can think of that you can modify the environment to set kids up for success? So you can share school modifications or home modifications. What do you guys think?
I love my friend's house. She's got a picture of the clean room. Her kid standing in the picture to know that he did it. And then a list at the bottom of all the things that he has to do as a check off list, right? I have always admired that. I've never done it in my house, but
That is
I've done it in my
awesome.
classroom. I just,
So she has a great example of a visual. So if you guys didn't hear that, taking a picture of the clean room, so they have that exact example, this is the standard. That that can really take out a lot of the arguing. So, thank you.
It's not necessarily modified environment, but I'm thinking of the environment and organization and, you know, when you're in a pre-K classroom and they've got this block goes here and they cut out like a piece of wallpaper and stuck it. So it's, they always know where to place things. It's
Right.
a huge environmental change that reduces stress.
Absolutely. Well, imagine if I want Jess to do her homework here, but she's got her phone, she's got her coffee, she's got access to all these reinforcers right next to her. Her escape behavior will be higher because she has access to it, right? If I simply remove these things during homework time, she has less distractors, she's less tempted to be off task, you know? So that's just an easy example of how you set up the environment, whether you want them to have access to reinforcers or not. I don't know if you guys listened to the presentation with Colleen, I think her name is, Christine. She was talking about how she modified the environment by bringing along reinforcing things when Abby struggled with transitions, right? So she brought things to the transition to make the transition itself more reinforcing. So that is an excellent way that we can modify the environment during struggle times. Let's add in reinforcement. So when we're thinking about children engaging in escape behavior, that's because there's something punishing about that. And we're using the term punishing as just a general ABA term for they don't like it. There's something bad or negative about that environment. And so when a child thinks an environment is punishing, they're going to escape it. So we can change that association by adding reinforcement, adding things that they like to that situation so that their brain is unconsciously learning, hey, I like this situation. I don't need to escape it. This is good, not bad. So there are a million ways we can modify the environment. So if your student is struggling, think about, is there any way that I can change the environment? Is there any way that I can change their access to things to make it easier or to make it harder? One really small thing that people do is increasing or decreasing the response effort of something. So say you want a student to do something more often, like throw things away, for example. But the garbage is like way far away. The response cost or the difficulty of that is it's too hard for students. They're like, nah, not worth it. Simply moving the garbage can to a closer location can decrease litter. There's actually been some funny studies that they've done on college campuses on just trash and people's behavior around it. And the placement of the garbage can is huge for how much litter there is. So, you know, there's just tiny ways like that that we can easily modify the environment to shape behavior without having to do anything drastic at all. All right, so we talked about schedules. There can be verbal schedules, there can be visual schedules, electronic schedules, and then self-management schedules. So as I said earlier, the pros and cons with antecedent strategies is if there gets to be a dependence on it, where then they can't be successful without them. So please be mindful of if your student is too dependent on it, or if your student is at a place where you can start to fade them off of it and make some plans where they don't need it. Because ultimately, we don't want that dependence. So visual or verbal schedule can be based on where your student's at. It could be part of your fading procedure. Maybe you start with a visual schedule and then they don't need that anymore. So you go to just verbal, and so that's part of your fading process. I really like electronic schedules because that can start to fade to the students and off of you. So if a student is always dependent on you to give that prompt, then they're always going to need somebody. So we want to transfer that off of ourselves so there isn't prompt dependence. So there's cool watches and apps and different things out there that will prompt students to do their homework, to focus, to listen. So my son has ADHD, and I actually got him this watch, that buzzes, and then I can program messages into it. So it buzzes and it's a reminder for him, oh, pay attention and listen, check yourself. You know, because he feels awful when he is off task. He feels awful, like he tries really hard, but his brain just goes elsewhere. And so just having that little buzz to remind him, like, hey, get back on track, that's enough of a prompt. And so there's really cool electronics now that can give you those reminders. You can program them in, or maybe your students are old enough that they have smartphones. I use so many reminders myself. I have schedules for myself that I use, and I'm sure all of you do it as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have recommendations on any kind of apps or anything that you do use? Like, what do you use with your son?
Revive is the name of the watch that I use with my son, but if you guys just Google watches for ADHD or habit trackers, I think there's an app specifically called Habit Tracker where there's a bunch of habits you can pick, and then you can also program your own in, and it like takes data for you, and so it's pretty cool. But there's so many. So if you guys just Google that kind of stuff, you're gonna find a lot of resources. So definitely be thinking about, this is a life skill this student is gonna need. So how can I transfer it to them in a way that they can sustain it themselves? Because we often are super helpful and we often want to give solutions, and so sometimes we don't think about, yes, this child is successful, but he's dependent on me. So we want to fade that off, and electronics is a big part of how we can do that. So proactive sensory movement. So I've talked about this a little bit today. The science behind movement is just so incredible. So if we can proactively get our students moving, when we move, it gives us dopamine, it gives us endorphins. It floods our body with chemicals that we need to self-regulate. So an interesting thing about the biology of our body, cortisol is the hormone we get when we're stressed. And so back in the day, we got stressed out because animals were chasing us. It was more of a flight or fight response that caused us to flee. So the blood runs through our system, it causes us to be super fast and all that kind of stuff. Well, what worked about that was that exercise that we did then got rid of the cortisol in our body, and it kind of shed it from us. But in our lives now, we get stressed out, and our coping mechanisms are to go home and watch TV, go home and veg out. And so what happens then is that cortisol just stays in our body. And so then we see it come out in headaches, we see it come out in stomach aches, mental health issues, all sorts of stuff, because we're not getting rid of the cortisol in our body. So stress is a normal part of our life, it's a normal part of our students' life. But if we're just piling on that cortisol and not getting endorphins, not getting serotonin and dopamine from exercise and other healthy activities like that, biology is fighting our emotional regulation. So if we simply add movement into our students' everyday routine, we are going to set them up for success. We're going to help their bodies be more balanced, and we're going to help them be able to regulate so much easier compared to if we have a really inactive student. And unfortunately, the way life is kind of shifting, our students are less active than the previous generation. And so that is having a mental health side effect on our students and adults. All of us are not as active as we used to be, and so there's already evidence of the consequences of that. So, what are your thoughts, guys? Movement is a huge deal. It really, really benefits our students. How can we add it in? How have you guys already added movement breaks in successfully in your classrooms? What are your ideas?
With sensory common little area that's like kind of our library that the whole school has access to. And it's a quick, it's jumping jacks, jump the lily pads, dinosaur stomp, crab walk, and a spin. Like it's quick, it takes like 2 minutes. And so like the kids who utilize a brain core, like they can go quickly do that and then get right back to class. Instead of like taking a walk.
I love that. It's quick, it's easy. I love it. I think I saw some hands over here. No? Okay, other ideas? Yes.
I do the hall duty in the morning for our kindergarten classes, and one thing that they said was after we did the dibbles that they were low on the sounds of all the letters and everything. So we just incorporated that would be my goal, and we're gonna go back and test it again in mid-year. But I've been pulling the big cards out, and I've just been telling them, name that letter, then we do this sound, and if it's C for cut, then we go and everyone does it together, and then if it's S for snake, we do. So we've added in the hand movements, and I try to make them cross the body, and they're excited about it. They're coming, they're ready to go. It's like they're wanting to get to school early for hall. So.
I love that. That's awesome. And what's cool about that is you're making learning more interactive too. So that helps the students be more engaged, and they're getting their bodies moving too. So that's awesome. Other ideas? What do you guys think?
We use Starfall, and it has motion songs that are also educational. It's really good.
That's really awesome. Have you guys heard of, is it called Gold Noodle? Yes, I know some classrooms use those and students seem to like them. Do you guys have any other recommendations for easy, quick movement breaks that could be implemented?
I just type on Google brain break, and they have like Fortnite dance battle or whatever, and it just does dance movements and then it freezes, and that's their favorite thing.
That is so cool. So I don't know if everyone heard that. She Googles brain breaks and she found some Fortnite dance moves and it randomly pauses.
Yeah.
So what's cool about that is it's incorporating movements. It's fun and interactive using something that's reinforcing to them, but then it also works on that impulse control. So you're incorporating a lot of learning into something that's fun and engaging for the students. So I love that. That's great brain training. Very cool. Any other ideas?
Simon Says.
Absolutely. So she just said Simon Says. So you could easily, in the middle of your lesson, be like, okay, Simon says stand up and do a jumpy jack. And it just can be a random thing to get the students going. And keep in mind, from a behavioral momentum standpoint, what students are doing, it's easier to keep doing. So if we're doing movement breaks, we might have to do some calming activities immediately after them to get them back to attending. So otherwise, I've heard some teachers tell me, I don't really like to do movement breaks because then my kids get all squirrely and it's hard to get them steady. So what we want to do then is use behavioral momentum in our favor, do the movement breaks, get them active, but then do calming activities to get them back into sitting. So, is that cool? Did everybody get a chance to fill this out? No. You did not? No. Okay. Would you mind passing that back? Thank you. So yes, if we can incorporate that in, it's going to help us. Just a little side note about behavioral momentum. You can use this for compliance as well. So it works on your spouses, it works on your students. So say you really want to convince your hubby to let you buy this like really fancy purse or something. So, tell him, hey, will you pass me that napkin? Sure, hon, here you go. Can I have a kiss? You bet, here's your kiss. Oh, by the way, I want to buy that like $2,000 purse. No big deal. So the fact that you asked 2 yeses in a row makes that third question more likely to be a yes. So it works with adults, it works with kids. It's just the way our brain works. We work with momentum. So if you have a student who struggles with non-compliance, you can ask them to do preferred things. much time. It needs to be immediate in order for it to work. So you're gonna ask them to do these easy things that you know that they'll do. Touch your head, touch your nose. Okay, now do your math problem. So it's as simple as that. And so it's just a quick, easy way that you can use that momentum to gain their compliance. All right, so switching gears of the brain. Have you guys ever had a student who's just like stuck on something? And because they're stuck, then like, you just can't get them past that situation, and so they're just kind of in a funk. So we can get past that by switching gears in their brain. Sometimes providing sensory experiences can help us switch gears. So if you take a student who's really struggling and you simply give them an ice cube, the sensory experience of an ice cube could be enough to switch their gears. Sometimes just saying something crazy, like, hey, look, there's all this. And they're like, what? What the heck are you talking about, you crazy teacher? And sometimes something goofy like that is enough to switch gears. And so if you can get a kid to kind of snap out of that just my heels are in the sand, I'm not moving, this is what I'm gonna do. If you can give them a different sensory experience, if you can kind of change the subject, things like that to switch their brain, they maybe will then move out of the fight or flight part of the brain. So in our brain, we have the prefrontal cortex, that's where you're using your reasoning, your logic, but you also have your amygdala, which is your fight or your flight. And so if you're working with a student who is currently acting out of the fight or flight part of their brain, it's going to be very hard to get success with them. So we need to switch gears. We need to help them get out of that fight or flight mode so they can use reason and logic again. So sometimes switching gears like that, sensory experiences, being silly about something random is enough for their brain to be like, huh, what just happened? Oh, I'm not as scared anymore about what that one thing I was fixated on. So the next one is using their problem behavior as a reward. So if your student is constantly trying to escape the classroom, you know that's motivating for them. You know that they're willing to work to get out of the classroom. Usually, kids don't like trashing the classroom. It's not fun for a kid to scream and cry. That's not fun. But if it works, they're gonna do it. They're willing to put in the work because the reinforcement value of that is enough. So use that in reverse. Like, hey, I see you really don't want to be in class today. Would you like to earn to get out of it? Well, you can. Here's what you can do. You know, so if you identify this kid has massive attention-seeking behavior, they are just constantly seeking attention, use that as a reward. Let them earn that attention so that they can work to get it in a positive way rather than the way that they were working to get it before. So if you can ever identify a problem behavior that you can flip into a reinforcement, that could be incredibly motivating for your students. So, and like a lot of times, we maybe wouldn't want to give escape, but say you have a kid who is having problem behavior all the time, and they're not getting much learning at all. If we reward them with escape, and slowly build up their tolerance to being in the classroom, that could be a really effective procedure. Sometimes we're so focused on the end goal that we're not willing to accept reinforcing steps or using a shaping procedure where it's like, okay, they have been successful for an hour. Let's reinforce that. Let's allow them to have some escape. Then we're gonna bring them back, right? So be okay with using shaping procedures to build up your end goal. Because sometimes we just want a kid to be successful in the school all day long, and then it's just too much for them, versus if we're willing to take a step back and be like, okay, we're gonna start at half days and reinforce that heavily, and then build it up, we're gonna have a lot more success.
What would be the first step of introducing that? Like how long do they have to, like, stay in class, that, you know, to get that versus skate, like, to make it work? Because I know I cannot ask to stay in till 10 o'clock. That's not happening, because then it's gonna, something else is gonna trigger. But to start that process of earning what is, you know, his behavior out, to get out.
Yeah, so that would be based on the individual student, because you want them to be successful. Say you know the student could not make it until 10 o'clock.
Like we say the pledge and then he's a break.
So say that again?
We say the pledge and then he's a break.
Okay.
So it's, right now, it's escalating in time. So like, how would you start rewarding with that?
So for that, that's pretty hard because you're talking like 2 minutes and he already needs a break. So essentially the rule I follow for that is you take baseline on what they engage in without escape, and then your reward is going to be right at that baseline level because we want them to access reinforcement. We want them to see, I can be successful at this. And so like 2 minutes, like this procedure might be
That's
hard
not
to...
wanting to, whenever they start the day with this, what he doesn't want, like he
Okay.
struggles with. So
Sure.
it's more, so after you complete that, then
Yeah, so how about, like for this example, you get through the Pledge of Allegiance, then you get a break. If you get through it nicely, you get a break. And then once they're doing that successfully, you're gonna add to it.
next.
Yeah, so maybe one more short activity or just delaying it a little further. But you want the reinforcement to be so consistent that enough of the brain training has happened. Because as I said earlier today, learning occurs unconsciously, and we're constantly making those associations. So if we're moving on too quickly, the brain hasn't made a powerful enough association for you to get the results you're looking for. So we want a heavy, consistent history of reinforcement, so you've got that brain trained and associated with that reinforcement. So you're gonna want to stick with that long enough that he's like, this is so easy, I'll sit for this, no problem. Then you're ready to move to the next step. Any other questions with that?
I was just gonna add, we use a yes card, and you can use like icons or just the boxes. And you can break up a Post-it note and you've got like a picture of the flag. As soon as he does that, it's a check mark and he gets his break. Well then, after he did so many of those, you add the pledge and then maybe the ABC, remember the alphabet. And so he's gotta get 2 check marks now, and he gets that treat. And you make that treat like so huge. And you move it, there's like the bar, you move the bar to here, so now he knows I gotta get these 2 before I get the thing. Anyhow, you can increase that yes card. After you've done 2 blocks, then you do 4 blocks, then you put in another one, now it's 6 blocks, and you put another one, and that's 8. So,
Yeah. And one thing I like about what you're saying too is making a visual for the reward system. So sometimes we create a reward for kiddos, but then we don't remind them of the reward, and it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And so if we have a visual right on their desk of, hey, this is what you're earning, don't forget, this is what you can get, they're more likely to be motivated. Because if they're distracted by their environment and they forget about it, they're not working for it anymore. So bringing in those visuals to help them remember, like, hey, this is what I'm working towards, is gonna help them stay engaged. So this last one here is validate the emotions, not the behavior. So this is one really important piece about working through problem behaviors. Sometimes it's tempting to focus on the behavior and tell the child, don't do that, that's not appropriate. But we can get pretty far with managing behavior through validation. So recognize, like, hey, I see you're having a really hard time right now. Like, you must be really upset. Let's work through this. Let's figure out a way that we can help you manage this without getting in trouble like this. Like, oh man, you must be so angry if you're willing to throw and hit people right now. You must be so upset. Let's come up with a solution that works a little better for you so you don't get in trouble for this. So when you give that validation, it reduces the defense mechanisms, right? They feel the validation rather than feeling defensive and feeling like they need to defend themselves more. So often we tell people, like, don't be mad, don't be upset, but that's actually really harmful to say. Emotions are okay. It is okay whatever you feel. It's the behaviors that are the problem. So we want to teach kids, like, okay, you have these big emotions. That is okay. So now let's figure out what to do when you have those big emotions. How do you have these things that you feel and not get in trouble? We can help you navigate this. So then you're partnering with the child rather than kind of coming down on them as an authority figure who's going to provide punishment or something like that. So,
What is the suggestion
oh,
for like if you have non-verbal or combative?
would you? I can't quite hear you. I'm sorry.
Do you have any suggestions like for non-verbal, like how you do that if they're combative and you're trying to replace those therapies? Like, do you have some suggestions for that as well?
Sure. So she was asking, what about students who are nonverbal? So one thing I really can't stress enough when it comes to nonverbal students, so often they understand way more than they can communicate. So never assume that your nonverbal student doesn't understand. They most likely do. So provide that validation still. You might need more visuals. You might need more strategies like those first then visuals, different cards like that to help them understand and make sure. You can also do receptive interactions where you give them choices and just to ensure they're understanding, like touch the picture that, okay, we're gonna do this next, do you understand? Yes, you know, and so sometimes those interactions can be helpful, but to those nonverbal students, I would still validate their emotions. I would still, you know, definitely like have those conversations like, oh man, I see you're really upset right now. I can tell because this is what you're doing, you know, and so just describing it to them. But yeah. So first then boards. These are super effective. It sounds like some of you are familiar with them already. One thing to just keep in mind, when it comes to first then boards, you have to be consistent with it because the whole point of it is they're motivated because there's a guaranteed contingency. But if this student has a learning history that you present first then, and it's not always first then that tool is not going to work for you at all. So just keep that in mind, and also keep in mind how reinforcing the then is. So typically, like, this works good if the first thing is not preferred and the second thing is really preferred. But when we're thinking about reinforcement values, if the first thing is highly, highly, highly aversive to them, you're going to need that second thing to be highly, highly, highly reinforcing. So you want it to compete. So the way I visualize it in my head is like a scale. So if you have a scale on both sides, you need the reinforcement to be heavier than what it's competing with. And sometimes we really struggle to find reinforcement that's powerful enough to compete. So we just want to be mindful of that. If you're not seeing the behavior change that you want, it could be because our reinforcement is not powerful enough. And so, so keep that in mind with your first then boards. This point number 2, make the contingency immediate. So sometimes people do first then, but then they get distracted in the middle, and so there's a delay, and that is another way that you're going to make your first then less effective. So your student's going to learn, this isn't an immediate contingency, this isn't super consistent, so they're not going to care about it as much. So you want it to be immediate, you want it to be consistent, and you want to make sure the second thing is reinforcing enough, and then that's going to make it really effective. So if your student, thinking about those neural pathways, if your student has a consistent learning history, every time I'm presented with a first then, it's immediate, it's consistent, and it's highly reinforcing. Even just the visual is going to motivate them to get through that behavior because they have that learning history there. So if you do it right, the associations will do some of the work for you.
Can you give us an example of a first then situation?
Sure. So she asked for an example of first then situations. So you could say you're going to do 2 homework assignments, 2 math problems, and then after that you can have a movement break. Or you can go chat with Miss Sally as soon as you're done doing this assignment. You know, so you give whatever task you want them to do in that moment, and you make it pretty specific. You don't just say, do your homework, but it's not really defined. So you want it to be really clear to the student. You're gonna do 3 problems, or you're going to do 5 minutes of homework, or, you know, so you wanna make it super clear so it's not up for debate what they have to do, and then whatever the fun thing is next.
And so you have it on the board and you hand it to them?
So it can be verbal. You can just say it to them. Some people have laminated cards that they use that says first, then, and there's Velcro, and so they can swap out pictures. So it can look different. Some people write it just with words. So has anyone here used any other variations other than what I just described for first then?
I have a to-do and done board.
Oh, okay,
So
yeah.
like a list of like something that's preferred, something that's kind of not preferred, and then something that's preferred. And then they do like that task, and it's done in a bit, and then they do the harder one, and then they have an easier task, and it's finished, and they can get up.
That's awesome. So yeah, so it can be done like that. A lot of times with students, I'll do a my choice, your choice, or my choice, your choice, depending on the student. And so that's a little bit more open-ended, but I use that as a fading procedure. So maybe they're like really good with first thens and they're consistent with that, but I don't want them dependent on that. So now I'm going to be fading it off where it's more vague on purpose, where it's going to be my choice. You don't know how long. You don't know specifically what it is. It's just a my choice activity. And then you get a your choice activity, and I'm just going to define a few rules around that. Like, we can't go to Disney World, and, you know, like, you're going to give some parameters, but, you know, so then that's a way for you to fade off that dependence. But when we're first starting with first then, we need that consistency and for it to be really clear. Does that help answer your question?
Are y'all older kids or just elementary? I think for high school, a lot of it, since they're just older and don't need all the maybe graphics and stuff, it's just more of first in, dry erase on their desk.
Yeah.
You know, it's just a simple first in.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I don't know how easily you guys can see this. I actually found this on Pinterest, and I decided to include it in my slide because I thought it was really creative. So we want to add more reinforcement into the environment. If you want a behavior to continue, it needs to access reinforcement. And so, attention is very powerful, so we talked about that, and comments on good behavior. I like how nice you're sitting. I like how nice you are working on your homework right now. You have focused for a really long time. Thank you. You know, like, be specific and consistent about that phrase, but there are other creative things that you can do. So I'm just gonna read some of these. This made me laugh. Shoes off. Like, what an easy way to give a free privilege, right? I think to a lot of students that would be pretty cool. Like, what? I get to take off my shoes? Cool. You know, so extra recess, bring a stuffed animal, read to the class, use a fun pen, choose a brain break, use special supplies, extra credit, be the messenger, choose your place in line, movie time, read to another class. So there's just so many creative, free activities up here. What are some other things, like what can you guys think of that you could reward a student with, that you could just implement in the classroom during the day, and it wouldn't cost money, and it'd be like free to cheap? So like I'm thinking of like the no shoes I saw you first.
I have two teachers, one does a hat pass, and another one they actually get to, if they say some outstanding thing that no one else caught, or something like that, that she gives up her chair for, one of the lessons.
Oh, cool. That was awesome. Did you say for the first part a hat pass?
A hat pass.
Okay, so like they get to wear a hat?
They get to wear a hat pass, that cost her nothing.
Oh,
Very
nice.
nice.
Very cool. I love those ideas. What else?
Chromebooks, we have access to Chromebooks in our classroom, and so if they completed their tasks, they can go on Chromebook and do like a game or something like that.
That's awesome. Yeah. What else, guys? What other
We did that, like, pure attention, like allow them to tell a joke.
Oh, yeah. Right. No, that's an awesome example. Come tell us a joke or tell your friend a joke. I love that. That's free, super easy, can be quick. That's awesome. Any other ideas?
We had a student, I'm a school principal, and we had a student who, we just don't find many things to motivate. He wanted to do the afternoon announcements and call the bus riders, so we let him do it. One of our students wanted to work with the custodian and use his electric screwdriver. So we said, sure, why not? So, just don't call it emotional on this.
That's awesome. So those are great examples of free, easy things to do. And asking our students sometimes for ideas can be really helpful. Like I would not have guessed that I could use the janitor as a reinforcer for my students, but maybe that would be very reinforcing for several students. Yeah, and it teaches them life skills.
And I think that is lifting and like
Oh.
using your movement and your muscles and.
Absolutely, yes, that would be good for them too.
In the cafeteria, they like to wipe the tables after everyone's done eating.
Oh, funny.
Like, if they behave, they like to wipe their tables.
He's cleaning as a reinforcer? I love it. Oh man, I wish I found cleaning that reinforcing. Alright, so we just did that. Okay, so punishment risks. So just keep in mind when we're using punishment in the classroom, it is really risking an increase in problem behavior. So if you were in my last presentation, I talked a little bit about the research behind schools and punishment procedures. So when we're looking at the charts, the higher the punishment procedures in the school, the higher the number of aggressive incidences, and even higher number of school shootings. So it's pretty drastic results of if there's a lot of punishment procedures, there's a lot of problem behaviors. So that is why it is so important that we focus on reinforcement systems. How can we reinforce behavior? So the science of behavior says if a behavior gets reinforced, it's going to happen again. And so if it gets punished though, that only suppresses it temporarily. It works in the moment, so you think, sweet, that worked, I'm gonna keep doing it. But it's likely to happen again in the future and oftentimes worse. So some of the punishments we use actually are reinforcing. So if a student is getting out of work, if they're getting out of class, things like that, that is reinforcing. And so that is a really common way that we provide a punishment for a student, but oftentimes that's reinforcing the behavior. And if a behavior is reinforced, that means it's more likely to occur in the future. So removal from recess could accidentally cause an increase in problem behavior because they're missing out on that movement break. So remember what I said earlier about how movement provides serotonin and endorphins and dopamine, things like that, into our system that makes it easier for us to self-regulate. So if you have a student who is struggling with self-regulation and you take away their recess, that is really going to hurt them. So we do not want to take away students' movement breaks. The last one is your punishment will mean nothing if they're getting reinforced by their peers. So just keep in mind if it is socially reinforced to engage in problem behavior and they are surrounded by those peers and have a lot of access to those peers that are reinforcing that behavior, it's gonna be hard for you to compete. So the research really shows schools have a lot of success when they separate the bad students. And I don't like saying bad because there's literally no person alive who's bad. We're all just a product of our environments and our patterns of punishment and reinforcement. But if we're looking at what students have a higher frequency of problem behaviors, we don't want those students hanging out. They're going to reinforce each other's behavior. So we want to separate them. We want to help that reinforcement come from good places rather than encouraging problem behavior. Group contingencies. So for group contingencies, this is a way you can get the classroom to work together. So if you were in my previous presentation on the good behavior game, that's a group contingency. So you can have group contingencies where everybody has the opportunity to individually earn it. You can have group contingencies where it's dependent on a small group of people or even one person to earn it for the whole group. Or you can have a group contingency where you guys all have to work together and perform together in order to earn that reward. So this is actually a way that using a group contingency to create social pressure, to create social reinforcement so students are encouraging other students to behave well. So for reward systems, do's and don'ts, so keep in mind if you're having the student manage the reward system, if you're having the student wait too long for the reward, if you're having the student, or if you're assuming what's reinforcing to the student, it might not work that good. So we want to make expectations really, really clear. We want to do a preference assessment so we know that what we picked is actually reinforcing to them, unlike my student with the sticker. We want to update the reward frequency because as some of you guys have shared today, what's reinforcing in the morning is not always reinforcing at night. So that can change frequently. So we want to keep those rewards updated. We want to be consistent with the rules of the reward system. So if one teacher's really good about it, but another teacher's not, or it's not followed through in a different setting, that's going to dilute the reward system, and then it's not going to work as good. So we need that consistency. And then we always want to calculate the math. Is the reward valuable enough to compete? If it's not valuable enough to compete with the problem behavior, it won't shape the problem behavior. So don'ts, we kind of talked through all of these. So just keep in mind, you will sabotage your reward system if you do any of these things. Sometimes we're like, I'm teaching my child responsibility, so I'm going to put them in charge of the reward system. If you do that, you might ruin the motivation. Sometimes people use the reward as a punishment. You just hit your sister, so I'm taking that reward away that you earned. If the student knows their reward can be taken away, that really wrecks the motivation. So that is a big one to avoid. So guys, we are almost out of time. It is just about 2:30, so I'm actually going to wrap up here. Like I've said in my other presentations, if you take anything home from this, just be analyzing those patterns of reinforcement and punishment. Behavior goes where reinforcement goes. So